Okay, for this chapter we are looking at evolution, coevolution, and we're also going to look at the evolution of the interaction between humans and the environment. All of these we're going to focus on natural selection and the processes that affect that. Give some examples of where you can see evolution in action. We'll introduce the Caribbean island lizards, and you will then have that as an interactive activity for about an hour during this class. And I'm going to finish with how human environment interactions have changed over time in certain cases. So overall, we want to think of things in terms of evolutionary fitness. How much does an individual provide their genetic contribution to the next generation and future generations down the road? To do that, you have to survive. You have to reproduce, and your offspring then must survive and reproduce. And the goal is to have a greater contribution of your genes relative to other genes, of other individuals contributing their genes. So think about this in terms of a peregrine falcon. These are the eggs of a peregrine falcon. It doesn't look like much of a nest, but that's a nest high up on a cliff tops. And then the peregrine falcon parents will, dive bomb ducks and shorebirds and gulls, and then or pigeons in the city, and then they'll bring the food back and feed their little fluffy white chicks. So you might ask yourself, how does the peregrine falcon maximize its evolutionary fitness? How can it have the best survival and the best genetic contribution to the next generation? Certainly camouflaging of the eggs, that's going to provide some sort of protection, parental protection, parental investment, but even things like why 3 eggs, why 3 chicks? You could do a better job of feeding them if you only had 2. But then you could potentially raise more of them if you had 5 or 10. Well, there's trade-offs with all of these things. Do you have a lighter or darker egg color? Are there advantages and disadvantages? Do you provide parental care or not? Some birds just lay the eggs once the chicks hatch. They pretty much fend for themselves. So the parents can lay more eggs. They don't have to take care of the kids. But then the kids, it takes them a while to figure out how to get food. They might be slower to grow. They might stay as young, vulnerable individuals a longer time. Do you have big chicks or smaller chicks? If you have a lot of big chicks, that's going to drain the energy of the parents. So you might have 3 that are slightly larger, but then only 1 clutch per year. Or you might have smaller ones, and then you have 2 clutches per year. How big is the clutch size? 3, 5, etc. How old before they become sexually mature? The next year, 5 years, 10 years, 2 years. What adaptations do you have for predation? Wing, speed, beak, talons, etc. You can think of a bunch of different ones. It has evolved to have typically 3 chicks in isolated locations, intensive parental care, effective predation by the parents. Some of evolution is going to take place through what we call natural selection, and some of evolution is going to take place through just sheer dumb luck, what we'll call random processes. And one of these random processes is the founder effect. So this is a floating plant called the water hyacinth, which can totally cover lakes and stuff like that. It's native to South America, but it's been accidentally introduced to a bunch of different water bodies. You can see the genetics of this depicted as different colors. In a lot of the areas that it's been introduced to, it's the red morph that has been introduced. But other ones, like in Africa, it's the blue, or the dark blue in some places. So in each of these areas, it just depends on what was the genetics of the clone that then got brought to that particular area, because all of the offspring then are tied to what the founder had. So some of evolution, it shifts the genetic composition relative to the founder population because you only have a subset that's actually invading the new habitat. In other cases, there can be what we call genetic bottlenecks, or the bottleneck effect. This is the case in the greater prairie chicken. It's a relative of the grouse. They used to be really numerous on the prairies, and now they're relatively endangered. And so 1930s, they might have been at 25,000 within that area, and then they've dropped dramatically to a few thousand in these locations. If we're looking at evolution, we're looking at the genetics of those populations. So for particular populations, you might look at the alleles. Pre-bottleneck, so even up to the 1930s, there were abundant populations of greater prairie chickens. They had diverse alleles at these genes that they were looking at, 5 or 6 different versions of the gene in these particular areas. However, once the population got bottlenecked and you only had a few of them, it's like the founder effect. You kind of take what you can get from there. And so post-bottleneck, you had a decrease in genetic diversity from, on average, 5.5 alleles for each of the genes down to about 3.5, 4 for each one. So there's a restriction of the genetic diversity, and that can potentially then impact what the characteristics of the population are in the future and how susceptible they are to a changing environment. So the other populations that are shown to the left, Minnesota, Kansas, Nebraska, those didn't have any bottlenecks. We're just looking at the Illinois population in this particular one. Some evolution occurs through natural selection. Kettlewell did a well-known investigation of the peppered moth. The peppered moth occurs in 2 forms, a light form that's kind of speckled, hence the name the peppered moth, and then the dark morph that is all black. And this investigation was done in 3 different ways. First of all, he placed them on different backgrounds, different trees, to determine how conspicuous they are to the human eye. So he asked people to start walking toward them until they could distinguish, oh, there's 2 moths, not just 1. And then that distance at which they were away from there, that was a measurement of how close they were. And as you can see, for the dark morph sticks out like a thumb, a sore thumb on the unpolluted woods, and the light morph sticks out like a sore thumb on the polluted woods. In the polluted areas of Britain, basically the air pollution had caused the lichens on the side of the tree to be killed off. The trees were dark, and they were still dark, but in most woods that didn't have pollution, they were covered by lichen, which is a fungus and an algae living on the outside of the trees, and then that provided camouflage for the light morph of these. Kettlewell then continued this in an aviary, so set up an aviary that he could walk into, and they could manipulate bird access to the peppered moth, place the moths on a conspicuous background and one where they would blend in, and then release the birds. The birds would come in, and initially they would just eat the ones that did not blend into the background. But birds are smart, so they figured it out, and they realized, oh, it's feeding time. They would pick the one that stuck out first, but then they would start looking up and down the tree to see, oh, I bet you there's another moth here. He did that before. And so they would end up eating all of the moths, but the ones that they would pick out first were the ones that were more susceptible to predation. Then finally he did this experiment in the field, marked and recaptured some of them, placing them on the side of the trees in woods, and would see which morph the birds actually preyed upon more in the field. They wouldn't have any experience. They wouldn't know, oh, there's more bugs here. They would just be looking and picking out the ones. And that's what he found, that the ones that didn't blend in were strongly selected against by predators. So the way that this works is in unpolluted woods, dark morphs were 83% of the bugs that got consumed. Light morphs only 17%. So again, strong selective pressure. And then in the polluted woods, the light morphs were overwhelmingly consumed, 3-to-1 over the dark morphs. Now, one of the changes that then happened over time was that the frequency of the genes actually shifted over time, and the dark morph became relatively less frequent because in that part of Britain, they cleaned up their act and they reduced sulfur dioxide pollution. So the air pollution got cleaner. That's the blue line here. And then over time, the dark moths went from being the dominant form, which you would expect in polluted woods, down to about 20% after the 1990s. And that's because of natural selection. The lichens came back once the air got cleaner. Another classic evolutionary investigation was an investigation of guppy coloration in streams in Trinidad. In this particular area, there are two different predators. There's the killifish, which is a small predator. It mainly eats the really small guppies. And the pike cichlid, which you see at the bottom. This is a large predator, a largemouth predator. The pike cichlid mainly preys on the adult guppies. So it's eating big food. The small predator is eating small food, the juveniles, and it basically leaves the adults alone. Now, one of the things that they found there was that in the pools that had killifish, many of the adults would be brightly colored, lots of spots on the side. We know them from the guppies from the aquarium trade, where they've been selectively bred to increase coloration. In the wild, they actually have some color variation as well. They're not quite as brightly colored, not as many weird traits, but in the presence of a killifish predator, they are brightly colored. The males do that to attract a female so they can increase the likelihood that they will mate. However, in the pike cichlid pools, that wouldn't work because now you stick out and now you're going to get eaten. You got to survive and you've got to reproduce. So the bright coloration is promoting greater reproduction, but first you got to survive. So in those pike cichlid pools, the adult males tend to be more drab in color. They can still reproduce, but they've got to survive and they've got to hide from the predator. So the question then was, what would happen if you moved some of these guppies around? If you took the drab guppies below the waterfall, moved them up into a pool that had killifish but didn't have any guppies, they should potentially have that, and if evolution is working on them, you might see a shift in the genetics. And that's actually what they saw, because they moved them up there. The drab guppies, then, the ones that got to mate more were the ones that were slightly more colorful, and then slightly more colorful than that, and then slightly more in subsequent generations. And these guys can have a new generation in like 6 weeks. So it's very rapid reproduction and maturity with the guppies because they're so small. And so over a 2-year period of time, they actually dramatically increased the amount of coloration that they had. 22 months later, so 15 generations, the populations shifted their coloration as such. They went from, on average, 5 square millimeters of colored spots beforehand, doubling that to 11 millimeters of colored spots, so twice as colorful 2 years later. And the number of colored spots, they went from having on average 8.5 spots to the transplanted population had 12 spots. So this shows rapid evolution in a 2-year time period. A lot of times we think of evolution as, oh, it takes millions and millions and millions of years, but there's a lot of cases of evolution in action where you can actually see evolutionary change take place over relatively small periods of time because of dramatic differences in survival or dramatic differences in reproduction. A lot of times evolution is going to operate on modifying ancestral traits. So if you look at the bones of any mammal, whether it's a human, a cat, a whale, or a bat, the arm structure is going to be the same. So the human has a humerus bone at the top, a radius and ulna at the lower part of the arm, wrist bones, and then they have the carpal bones, which are the big long bones in the palm of your hand. And then at the tip, the digits are called, the little segments are called phalanges. Same sort of thing with a cat. 1 bone in the upper arm, 2 bones in the lower arm, wrists, longer bones, and then the phalanges. In the whale and the bat, it's modified, but you can basically see the same thing. So on a whale flipper, which it doesn't need to manipulate things like we do with our hand, it still has a humerus bone, a radius, ulna, and then the wrist bones, and then the carpals and phalanges extending out to provide support for the length of the flipper. In the bat, the radius and ulna are sort of fused together. Humerus is still there. And then the carpals are the wrist bones, and then the the metacarpals and the phalanges are extended out, and this provides supportive ribbing through the wings of the bat. So on the human and the others, the palm bones are the wrist bones are the carpals, the palm bones are the metacarpals, and then the bones at the tip are the phalanges. In other organisms like these invertebrates, these are a group of insects called tree hoppers. They possess these distinctive horns above the top of the body. These are basically a modification of these ancestral wings that they had. So by modifying the shape and the structure, they're not just growing a new set of wings, or they're not just making up a trait out of nowhere, but it's basically taking it and modifying it. And you can see all the different varieties that can be developed from that, that enables them to either blend into their surroundings or mimic an ant or a spider or something like that, and convey the possibility of survival and evolutionary success. There's basically three ways that evolution can occur. Directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection. So as a hypothetical example, consider a population of mice that varies in their fur color. Most of them are near average, a few are light, a few are dark. How is that going to change over time? Well, it depends on selection within the environment. Let's say that you're on in an area that has dark background, grassland with dark soils, dark plants. The ones that are lighter are going to stick out to predators. And so that's going to shift the population over time in the direction of more dark fur color. In the case of disruptive selection, let's say that you had two sort of areas. One was a set of dark rocks, and then you had light sandy soil. Well, if the mice could behave to hang out near where their coat color gave them the best camouflage, you would basically have what's called disruptive selection. It always selects against the average because the average doesn't fit into either environment. The light ones can live on the sand, and the darker ones can live on the rocks. And then stabilizing selection selects toward the average, getting rid of the two tails at the extreme of the distribution and favoring the center of the distribution. So this would be if they were in brown soil. The light ones stick out, the dark ones stick out to predators, and they become more average over time. Some examples of natural selection and speciation. So speciation is formation of a new species. One of my favorite examples is the bird life in Costa Rica. If you take a look at Costa Rica, the country, there's basically a series of mountain ranges, like the Talamancas, the Cordillera Central, and the Guanacaste, that basically separate the country of Costa Rica into a Pacific side and a Caribbean side. There's lowlands on each of the sides, and then there's high elevation mountain ranges. Through its development over the last 5 to 15 million years, when the land bridge formed connecting North America and South America, these island ranges rose up and basically separated the Pacific side from the Caribbean side. Now, birds could fly, but if you take a cross-section of this area, if it's a lowland bird, the lowland bird's happy in the lowland. If it's in the Caribbean lowlands, it's not going to get up and just fly over the mountain. That's a lot of work. And so they tend, even with mobile species, this tends to isolate them into different populations, those that are on the southern Pacific and those that are on the Caribbean. And then ultimately, they develop into brand new species from that. So here's some examples. On the southern Pacific side, you have a toucan called the fiery-billed aracari, whereas on the Caribbean side, one that looks a whole lot like this, but it's the collared aracari. The bill is not fiery red in color. It doesn't have an orange band across the center. It's a black band. But in all other aspects, they look pretty similar. It's not hard to imagine them sharing a common ancestor 15 million years ago. Same sort of thing with the manakins. On the Pacific side, the males are orange. It's an orange collared manakin, and the white collared manakin is seen on the Caribbean lowlands, and then in Nicaragua up to Belize, further north from there. Likewise, for woodpeckers, golden-naped and black-cheeked, very similar. Golden-naped only on the southern Pacific side, black-cheeked only on the Caribbean side. And the cotingas are a bird of the it's the lowland rainforest, but it's basically the canopy. So they live way up in the canopy. On the southern Pacific side, there's the yellow-billed cotinga with, guess, a yellow bill, and then the snowy cotinga, white in color, black bill for the males. The females look relatively similar. The beak color is different, but on either side of the mountain, they're going to have different morphological characteristics. Because the populations don't get back together, they've been separated and they've evolved into two different species with two different physical characteristics. Now, the ones at the bottom, the Sherry's tanager and the Passerini's tanager are two subspecies of these. Ornithologists have gone back and forth. At the time of the printing of this book, they were two separate species. Since then, ornithologists have lumped them back together as a common species based on behavioral studies that are looking at the ability of the birds to respond to the mating calls of the males. And you can see the female of the Sherry's tanager, orange on the breast, versus more drab in color on the Caribbean lowland side for the Passerinis. Currently, they're classified as two separate subspecies as part of the same species. It's not hard to imagine that they shared a common ancestor, and each of them stays on different sides of the mountain range and has evolved in isolation for a long time. Another notable example of speciation, these are the cichlids of the East African lakes. Lake Malawi, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Victoria. The numbers in here indicate how many species are there. Lake Malawi is just incredibly diverse, 1,000 species of cichlids. Lake Victoria around 500. Lake Tanganyika around 250. The other lakes are not as diverse, and each of the river drainage systems also has some more. So all in all, from those lakes in the rift valleys of East Africa, about 2,000 species. They basically just evolutionarily diverged so that they would divide up the habitat. Shallow water, mid-water, deep water. Organisms feeding on the bottom, straight up and down, organisms feeding on the side of rocks, basically feeding on the same food like algae, but in slightly different configurations, so slightly different shapes of their mouth would do better. They have differences in coloration patterns, and then they're only going to breed with ones that share their coloration patterns. Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika, you have these long, skinny rift valley lakes. So the species at the north is different from the guild of species in the middle, and is different from the guild of species at the south because they're kind of homebodies. They don't move around all that much. And so just simply by geographic isolation within the same lake, you could end up with 1,000 species of fish in Lake Malawi. So again, we might ask, why so diverse? Different feeding habits, feeding on different things, evolving different mouth structures to feed on different food items, enable them to diversify into many, many different forms. Geographical barriers. Once a fish gets to a new lake, they're not going to interbreed with the fish from the old lake. So those are barriers that then have led to formation of new species. Within a lake, the north end, the middle, and the bottom can have different guilds of species, as I mentioned, and they're kind of homebodies. They don't move around so much, and so they're not going to interbreed with each other, and that's ultimately led to the formation of species, different species in different parts of the lake. Reproductive barriers. A lot of these have incredible mating behaviors. They will follow ones that only have certain color patterns and breed with them. And then likewise, they've had these different groups that have evolved different abilities to build nests and care for their young. The basal species are what we call, the ancestral species are what we call broadcast spawners. The female and the male just lay sperm and egg in the water. Some of them join. The babies go in the plankton, and they're fine. Not a lot of protection from a predator, but if you release enough eggs, enough will survive. From there, some of them would then dig out a nest, lay the eggs in the nest and fertilize them in the nest, and then provide parental care to protect them so that the nest builders are not going to interbreed with the broadcast spawners. Then from there, they started setting it up where they were what we call mouth brooders. So they would lay the eggs in the nest, and then the female would come and pick them up and carry them in her mouth and basically protect the young. And wouldn't eat, but all the energy would go into caring for the young and protecting them. And then once the young hatched, they would be little fish, but they could dart back into mom's mouth. And so they provided protection from predators. Well, some of them got so good at that they basically were eating the eggs and getting the eggs before they were fertilized. So the males developed this strategy by having the eggs there. The female would scoop up the eggs that weren't fertilized, but then he would lay down on the ground and on the sediment at the bottom of the lake, and she thinks those are her eggs and would go after them, and then he would release the sperm and fertilize the eggs inside of her mouth. So the ones that do that bizarre behavior are not going to interbreed with any of the other ones, and thus reproductive behaviors help to develop new species. Coloration patterns I mentioned, and then maybe a hybridization event could have influenced this as well. We're going to take a look at Geospiza fortis. There's a film on this. If time permits, we're going to look at this a little bit more in detail. If you look at these three species of groundfinch on the Galapagos Island, Fulginosa, fortis, and Magnorostris, they each specialize on different size seeds. Magnorostris has a big beak to eat large seeds. Fulginosa, a small beak to feed on small stuff. Fortis, kind of in the middle. If they are on an island where there's only one species, a lot of times they'll converge at the average in between the small and medium-sized foods. And that's the beak depth that they'll have. They'll still sing the song of their people, but they won't, they'll be intermediate in size. And then if we look at the middle species, Geospiza fortis, on Daphne Island, there's a well-documented study by the Grants that looked at how the beaks varied in size. During a drought year in the mid-1970s, the abundance of seeds dramatically declined. The only ones that were left were the really, really big ones. And as the seeds became larger and harder, that's then selected for bigger beaks. Only the birds with big beaks could pass on their genes to the next generation, and their beak size increased by more than 1 millimeter during a 2-year period of time. So rapid evolutionary selection because of a change in food availability. We're also going to, if time permits, you're going to take a look at Lizard Evolution Virtual Lab. The hyperlink is here, or you can look for Howard Hughes Medical Institute Biointeractive or HHMI Biointeractive Lizard Lab, and enter the lab and try this out. This is a fun interactive activity. It kind of compares the species found in different areas, the canopy, the twig, the trunk, and then the grass. On different islands, these 4 morphotypes develop. They also will evolve differences in their dewlap, which is like their throat sac. In darker wooded areas, they will evolve brighter colors to better show off and attract a mate. Coevolution is evolutionary change in 2 species that rely on each other. So like pollinators and the flowers that they then pollinate. So hummingbirds are going to use flowers that have developed a long tubular shape. They'll feed on the nectar from the bottom, and then this ensures that some of the pollen gets on their beak and gets transferred to the next one. Bees are attracted to these types of flowers, especially the ones that have kind of a bullseye, like a central flower part and then the flowers surrounding it. This is in the sunflower family, and so it has these ray flowers on the outside and the disc flowers on the inside to draw them toward their target. And then the bats are going to use the saguaro, and the pollen basically gets stuck in there. So each of the flowers has responded to which pollinator type it has, and each pollinator has responded based on the flower that's available. Finally, I want to examine how the interaction between humans and their environment has changed over time, giving a few agricultural examples. So in this first example, we'll consider the house design of mountain people and lowland people living in Vietnam. Vietnam has a colonial history like many places do, and when the French colonized that particular area, they wanted people to work in the mountains in order to cut forests and work on the rubber plantations. And so they wanted to move people from the lowlands up into the higher elevations and have them work there. Now, traditionally, in the mountains, the houses are built with sort of like a barn or a stable underneath the house raised up, the cooking fire contained within the main part of the building. And then in the lowland, it's a lot hotter. That doesn't work. And so they would put their fire outside, they would cook outdoors. The animals have their own separate barn, and then there's the human living quarters within that particular area. So the lowlanders moved to high elevations. Basically, this is how they knew how to build houses, so that's how they build houses at high elevations. And they found that they were catching malaria and dying of malaria after they moved to higher elevations. Well, what's the reason why this happened, and why did they do that? First of all, at low elevations, the mosquitoes in Vietnam don't transmit malaria. So that was never an issue for people that lived in the lowland. But when you take the lowland people and move them up into the mountains, and they still keep the same house design, then that was potentially a problem, as I'll explain. When lowlanders moved to high elevation, again, they kept that traditional structure, so now they're building the same sort of thing. It doesn't seem like a big issue, but that was the difference in whether they caught malaria or not. The reason for this is that the high elevation mosquitoes carry malaria, and they happen to be deterred by smoke. So if you have a cooking fire in your house, even though you don't want to be breathing in the smoky fumes and things like that, that cooking fire was enough to deter the mosquitoes from coming into the house. They wouldn't come in and they wouldn't bite people. The mosquitoes tend to stay more at ground level, and so they would go down, they would bite the animals. The animals can deal with mosquitoes and malaria. They don't really catch malaria, so it wasn't an issue for them in that area, but so because the mosquitoes bite the cattle instead. However, you take the other house design, the cooking fires are now outside, so there's no smoke inside the houses. The mosquitoes still might bite the animals, but they also might get into the house and bite people, and then that led to an increased frequency of malaria within this particular area. So this is a case of how our interaction with the environment under new environments, a lot of times people have developed these setups because it works for them. They're able to socially thrive in that sort of system given the environment there, and moving to a different habitat, sometimes it's hard to adapt. We talked about human interactions in terms of agricultural land. Slash and burn agriculture is practiced by a wide variety of people. Different crops are planted, usually a diverse suite of several crops. In this, after the first few years, bamboo is planted and then it grows up, but then the trees and stuff take over and it makes it unsuitable for the plants that they're putting in there and the annual crops that they're cultivating. So at some point they give up on this, they'll go slash down a new area and they'll build that in that area. And they don't reuse the same site immediately, allowing the soil fertility to build up. And this has worked for many people for a long period of time. European settlers in North America, both were used to having a diverse variety of crops, and then also saw the Native American tribes that had different crops growing in those locations. And so this is a reenactment on Roanoke Island in North Carolina, just kind of depicting what a garden would have looked like a long time ago. Each family would have had their own agricultural plot. Each would have grown enough for their needs. But over time, this then got changed. So this is from the movie Interstellar. It's basically just massive, massive fields of corn. As far as the eye can see, this is set in the future, and there's one part where they drive a car memorably through the cornfields going after a drone. But it just, to me, corn, as far as the eye can see, shows how our society has shifted toward we can grow it cheaper if we have a monoculture and if we have combines that do this for us and things like that, rather than we can stop the spread of pests if we have a variety of different crops that have different vulnerabilities to different crops, and they're not all going to get wiped out if one gets wiped out. So it kind of shows that difference. Historically, Central Americans practiced a polyculture called the milpa. This is from Belize. They grow beans among the corn. The beans can then grow up the top of that. In some places, they would add pumpkin or squash to kind of keep the weeds at bay. But this wasn't the only thing that they grew. They'd have a field that did that, and then they'd have banana trees in the background. Cultivating bananas, and they might have cacao, or they might have a range of different foods within this area. In contrast, the way the bananas are currently grown, it's plantation style. Each of the trees is a cultivar. It grows up and it basically makes one flowering stalk and one set of those, and then out of the side there will be a little vegetative propagule that would come up, and then it kind of takes over and grows there. Once the bananas get to a certain size, they'll place a bag over them to basically prevent them from being pollinated. And this is so that the bananas don't have seeds inside of them. If you look in the evolutionary past, bananas had relatively large seeds in them, and we're used to eating ones that are genetically modified to not have that. And they do that just simply by putting a bag over it to stop fertilization. Then the bananas are cut down once they reach maturity. They're shipped to a central area. They're broken into bunches. Notice they're picked while they're green. This is because it takes a week or two for them to get to supermarkets abroad. They're dipped in a sanitizer. They're sorted. They're cut into sizes. They're packaged, and then they're shipped out from there. Along the way, they ripen, and then we end up with fresh bananas when we get them at the store. But they're not really fresh. They're a week or two old because that's how our agricultural system is set up. In contrast, in a polyculture system, this is in Costa Rica, organically raised bananas. There's going to be some fertilizing taking place here, but you can still eat the bananas, and they're still really tasty. You can allow them to ripen on the tree so they're actually fresher. She didn't grow coffee, but there was other ones nearby that would grow. Coffee's usually more at higher altitudes. Cacao was also raised on this one. She relied on native bees to farm, to fertilize the crops within that area, and then just had a mix of different ones, hand-tended, organically raised, and it kind of brings something different to that particular area. And it's certainly, you've got a diversity of crops. It's better for pest management, not relying too much on pesticides, but more on integrated pest management. And if one crop fails, then other crops will succeed.